and Verizon 1964, and webcast on www.boston.gov/citycouncil/TV. Please silence your cell phones and other devices. We will also take public testimony and would appreciate it if you sign in to testify. At the start of the testimony, please state your name, address, and affiliation. Today's hearing is on docket 1420. This matter is sponsored by Councilor Michelle Wu and was referred to the Committee on Planning, Development, Transportation. It's in order for a hearing regarding implementation a one-card municipal identification program in the City of Boston. Again, I want to thank Councilor Wu for her leadership on this hearing and Mayor Walsh for his leadership on this issue as well. I look forward to this conversation today regarding the municipal ID program and what steps we need to look at moving forward. A City of Boston study indicated that more than 140,000 of our residents encounter difficulties due to lack of identification. That means 1/5 of our residents may have trouble opening an account at a financial institution, cashing a check, using a credit card, applying for a job, assessing a building. This issue has a significant impact also on our homeless community, transgender community, and immigrant community. There may be incentives or benefits that come with having a municipal ID, as well as the ability to streamline services efficiently. Moreover, other cities have also implemented this, such as New Haven, San Francisco, New York, and Washington have similar programs. I also understand that there are concerns about misuse, as well as various officials having access to parts of the data from the card that may not be relevant. Again, I look forward to hearing from folks, from you, on how we can work on this issue together. At this time, I would like to ask the councilors present if they would like to make an opening statement, beginning with Councilor Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you making time for this hearing. We have a jam-packed council calendar, and so I know, for example, Chief Marty Martinez had really wanted to be here but had a time conflict, and others, so I appreciate you stepping in and sharing the detailed knowledge of the feasibility study results. Again, I wanted to seek an update on the process because the council and the administration have been having this conversation for over 3 years now, and the dynamic obviously has changed with the federal election in between, but the original intent remains the same, to make sure that the City of Boston is as welcoming and inclusive a city as possible for residents of any background. And having seen that in other cities, a municipal ID program helps reduce and eliminate that gap, the barrier for communities who find it difficult to access formal government-issued ID, particularly when it comes to housing status and those experiencing homelessness, when it comes to immigration status and those who may be undocumented immigrants, when it comes to gender identity and our neighbors and friends and residents in the trans community. So again, because of the national political context, any program such as this, which seeks to eliminate some of the barriers, must, in its first most important step, make sure that it is secure and safe and not at all harming or putting at risk some of the residents or communities that are mentioned. But we have seen other cities do this to great success when it is sold as a cultural amenity and a convenience for people. When that one card also gets you a year's membership at the museum or the aquarium or a bike share system, when it also is your tap card for the MBTA and your library card and your student ID. So I'm grateful to the administration for having taken it this far, having allocated funding for the feasibility study and now completed it and reporting back to us, and looking forward to hearing more about what the findings are. So thank you again to Mr. Chairman and all of my colleagues for being here.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. For the record, I'd also like to acknowledge City Council McCarthy is present. And Councilor Siomo, would you like to provide an opening statement?
Just very quickly, I want to thank Sponsor. Oh, yeah. He didn't see him.
Go ahead.
Are you sure? Anyway,
Okay.
so
It's, go.
Okay.
I'm older.
It's the dean of the council.
The dean.
So.
No, I think this is the time has come to look at this, but I'm always going to ask the questions about the financial implications of implementing these programs and the oversight and such. You know, the state obviously issues identification cards, and that's part of what they do. This would be a whole new service that we provide. I think it's worthy. We do give out library cards, but we need to always be mindful of the cost to the city, to the treasury, to the taxpayers. And when we implement things like this, sometimes it may be at the cost of other services and programs for the city. So thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Councilor Siomo. Councilor Zachem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just thank Councilor Wu for continuing her efforts on this, and I think I'm surprised, well, not that surprised, but it's interesting to see how long this discussion has been ongoing, and it's important that we keep doing it, and acknowledging the political realities that have shifted on a national scale is important. I'm interested in hearing, I believe, New York, and we had a remote testimony from the individual who runs the New York's program 2 years ago in this chamber, how they've addressed issues around data retention, privacy, you know, working with, to the extent we can work with MassDOT. I know they still have an issue of their own that needs to be resolved by the governor around issuing driver's licenses and other identification to undocumented people. But certainly any sort of municipal ID card the city of Boston has, there's no reason it couldn't have a T-Pass on it. There's no reason it couldn't be a library card, or it couldn't be your card for our BCYF centers, or really anything else that the city does. And, you know, I'm interested in seeing how we can do that. And I know that there are other cities. I've had conversations with officials in Somerville and Cambridge, in the immediate area, who would be interested in partnering with us on this to address some concerns perhaps around cost savings and economies of scale. And I want to make sure we're addressing that, and that we are also doing everything we can to make this ID as strong as it can, so it is valid for people who are, you know, trying to enter buildings, or to the extent that it can be valid for banking purposes, for other things that we need to do. And I know obviously the city's authority on that may be limited, but we need to make it as useful as possible. I think we need to do this, certainly because the state is not moving on this in Massachusetts, and obviously the federal government is not doing anything constructive on this front whatsoever, or any front whatsoever these days. But looking forward to hearing where we are on this, and thank you for this. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this and fitting it in with our crammed agenda these days.
Thank you, Councilor Zachem. Councilor McCarthy? Okay. At this time, we'd like to recognize Andre Lima, Director of Policy and Research, Mayor's Office of Health and Human Services. Mr. Lima, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Flynn and Councilor Wu, other members of the council. Thanks for this opportunity to speak about docket number 1420 and provide an update on the municipal ID program, specifically the municipal ID feasibility study. Again, my name is Andre Lima, the Director of Policy and Research for the Mayor's Office of Health and Human Services, and I'm here testifying today on behalf of Marty Martinez, who's the Chief of Health and Human Services for the city. Councilors Flynn and Wu did a tremendous job already of summarizing, giving an overview of what municipal ID cards are, but I'll just continue that primer by saying, kind of defining municipal ID programs for the council. A municipal identification card or card program is simply a form of identification or an identification card that's issued by a municipality, such as a city, rather than a state or federal government. And under federal law, cities can issue their own ID cards as they see fit. And they don't have to consider immigration status or the criminal record of an applicant if they choose not to. As I believe Councilor Zakim mentioned, or perhaps it was Councilor Wu, New Haven, Connecticut was the first city to launch a municipal ID program in 2007. It's called the Elm City Resident ID Card, but probably the most well-known and largest municipal ID program is the ID NYC program in New York City, which I believe was launched in 2014. Municipal ID cards usually feature a photo and some on-card information about the cardholder, their address, their name, for example. But they also, and more importantly, facilitate access to benefits and city services. They can act as library cards. There are some cities that have municipal ID cards which have an embedded debit card functionality. Sometimes they offer access or discounted access to transportation services, and there are a myriad of other discounts to museums and cultural institutions, sometimes local businesses that are associated with municipal ID cards in certain cities. And although they're available to all residents, the cards are particularly valuable for, as Councilor Wu and Flynn mentioned, to vulnerable community members, undocumented immigrants, people experiencing homelessness, older adults, youth to a certain extent, or other people who may have difficulty obtaining formal forms of government-issued identification. And so the concept of a municipal ID in Boston grew out of a collaboration between HHS and the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. And this was actually before I started in my role at the city, but my understanding is that HHS was involved primarily because the Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement sits within the HHS cabinet. And as I mentioned before, municipal ID programs can be a really effective tool for empowering immigrant communities, especially immigrant communities that include undocumented residents. And public support for municipal ID programs in Boston as well as other cities has been galvanized primarily by immigrant serving and advocacy organizations. And so the collaboration between HHS and the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics resulted in $100,000 worth of city funds being allocated to Boston Centers for Youth and Families for the purposes of further exploring a municipal ID in Boston as a concept. It was allocated to Boston Centers for Youth and Families, I'll just explain, because the HHS budget is actually part of BCYF's budget, and so that's why that's where the funds ended up. So originally this funding, again, there was a broad, it could be used for broad purposes. It was really to explore this concept. And the thinking at the time, and this is probably summer of 2016, was that that $100,000 would be used to pursue a small pilot program, for example, that would sort of test some of the design principles and the infrastructure requirements associated with a municipal ID in Boston. However, in November of 2016, Donald Trump was elected president, and because of the then president-elect's explicit anti-immigrant rhetoric, and particularly his expressed intent to use the power of the executive branch to punish sanctuary cities, or cities that have what we might call sanctuary policies like the Trust Act, the administration felt strongly that if Boston was going to pursue a municipal ID, it had to be with the support and input from the immigrant community, first of all, but it also had to be a program that was safe and secure for the most vulnerable users. And so at the time, we essentially had to stop and ask ourselves this question, which is really given the anti-immigrant policy platform of this federal administration, and at the time it was theoretical, and now it's quite real. Do immigrants and immigrant communities in Boston still want a municipal ID? And that question actually comprises two different dilemmas. The first being, the question of whether or not immigrant communities still feel that a municipal ID program in Boston can be safe and secure for undocumented residents, given the increased scrutiny and ramped up immigration enforcement under this administration. But also, does the community feel that a municipal ID program is the right use of resources now? Given that the struggle to preserve and expand, in some cases, the rights of immigrants in this country is being fought on so many fronts. And again, I'll just mention that I keep bringing up immigrants and immigrant communities, and although the advocacy for these programs has been primarily led by immigrant-serving organizations, I'll just, for the record, remind that municipal ID programs aren't exclusively for immigrant residents. And I would actually argue that characterizing them as such kind of overlooks some of its more broad benefits. Firstly, immigrant communities aren't the only communities, as Councilors Flynn and Wu have mentioned, aren't the only communities that face what we might call undocumentation. people experiencing homelessness, older adults, to a certain extent youth, people who don't own cars, for example, are all may be forced to navigate civic life without a formal government-issued form of identification, making it difficult to open a bank account, access certain public buildings, apply for jobs, among other things. So IDs, in some sense, are sort of the gatekeepers of access to these opportunities, which we often take for granted. So just to return to that question about, given the context and the climate around immigration in this country, we decided, given the circumstances, that the best way to use that $100,000 was to commission what we're calling, or what we called at the time, and are still calling, a feasibility study, which really is meant to better understand, firstly, the demand for a card program in Boston, especially among key communities, and then, granted that the program is still desirable for residents, to design a program that's safe and secure as possible for its most vulnerable users, but also a program that can be adaptable, and that can include benefits that appeal to other groups of residents and residents broadly, so that it could be widely used. And again, this is necessary both in terms of making the program sustainable, you know, if nominal fees are charged for obtaining a card, but also in terms of ensuring that the card doesn't become a scarlet letter, and that's really important. If only undocumented immigrants, for example, have a municipal ID card, it can be easily used as a tool for targeting undocumented immigrants. And so there's a delicate balance there. So HHS and the mayor's office collaborated in writing a request for proposals that we felt reflected the needs of the city with respect to a qualitative demand analysis and a kind of really robust program design. And on January 23rd, 2017, we released or issued the RFP for the Municipal ID feasibility study. We received dozens of proposals and ultimately chose the Triage Group, a DC-based consulting firm that was involved in the designing and implementation of the DC-1 card, which is the district's municipal ID. We chose them as the consultants for the project. And I served as the project manager for the work with the Triage Group. And so the work, the feasibility study that they completed, I'm going to kind of give you I won't be able to get into every last detail of the report now. And the report's actually been provided to the council, I believe. So, you know, you have the full, I think it's about 200 odd pages of text to read through. But I'm going to touch on some of the most important findings in each of the key areas of the report, sections of the report, which were the individual deliverables essentially for this contract. So, as I mentioned before, the first and kind of the base of this feasibility study is what we called, or we're calling it the demand analysis, which provides a qualitative and quantitative assessment of the demand for a municipal ID in Boston, something we were really interested in given the results of the presidential election in 2016. It also seeks to understand and present some critical findings about sort of the desired features of the card, so like what features of a card are most valuable to City of Boston residents, and also what some of the potential barriers to adoption are. So the Triage Group contracted with the UMass Center for Survey Research, UMass Boston Center for Survey Research, to complete this deliverable, which included focus groups with residents and an online citywide survey. And although it was limited in scope, the demand analysis does show a sustained interest in the community, also among immigrant residents and among leaders of immigrant-serving organizations in a municipal ID. Additionally, the analysis identified sort of key features that residents felt were valuable to the program, along with features that they felt weren't. But integrated Charlie card use, which I'm sure is no surprise, came up as would be very valuable to the program. Eligibility for discounts at cultural institutions and local businesses also were kind of focal points of the value proposition for people who responded to the survey and were kind of polled in focus groups. The analysis of the results produced a couple of key findings. A conservative estimate using UMass Boston's predictive modeling projects that about 32% of adult Boston residents would apply for and use a municipal ID card. More liberal estimate places that number at around 300,000 Boston residents. The primary concerns of residents continue to be the vulnerability of cardholder data to specifically Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but also other federal agencies, and then broadly a concern about the security of data, personal data generally. Additionally, the majority of residents who responded to the survey reported that they would be willing to pay about $10 for a card. So those are some of the higher level results of the demand analysis, which is contained in the actual report, which you have access to. And the next part of the report, which we are calling the program design, really builds on the demand analysis to identify the baseline design requirements for a municipal ID. Essentially, there are elements of the program and of any municipal ID program that are absolutely essential to its functioning. Without a governance structure, without issuance policies, without policies governing what cardholder information appears on the physical card and what cardholder information is stored by the city through the application process, you won't have a solid foundation to build a program unless you have these elements in place. And so these basic elements are laid out in this program design section of the report. And they're fleshed out in more detail in the penultimate deliverable, the penultimate section of the report, which is called the implementation plan. What I want to focus on here is what appear in addition to these baseline design elements are a set of what we might call alternative or optional design elements, which aren't absolutely critical to running a municipal ID program, but would change the overall structure of the program depending on whether they were included or excluded. And so they include, for example, as Councillor Zakim has already pointed out, geographic eligibility for the card. In other words, would residents of other cities and towns be able to apply for municipal IDs, or would they be reserved exclusively for Boston residents? Data capture is another optional or alternative design element. So the question is, will there be a system through which what we might call a relying party can capture cardholder data when a cardholder presents their card? A relying party is essentially an organization, it could be internal to the City of Boston or external, that has an agreement with the city to accept the card in exchange for access to a service or benefit for the cardholder. So that could be a library, it could be a BCYF community center, it could be a cultural institution, it could be the MBTA. And when a cardholder presents their card, the relying party can consume the card or process the card and information on the card in a variety of ways. One form of processing that sort of information, which we're all very familiar with, is a 2D barcode on a card. So the relying party would scan that barcode and they would have their own database that would be auto-populated with the cardholder's information embedded in that barcode. And while this creates more ease of use for the relying party, the cardholder's consent isn't implicit. In other words, a relying party could obtain a cardholder's information without the cardholder's full understanding or agreement to the relying party acquiring that information. That's one method of data capture. Another alternative method is to have a back-end data capture system. Essentially, the data about each cardholder is stored in a database and captured at the time the card is issued, and then stored by the city. The cardholder would, and then so the relying party would then have to request access from the city to that cardholder's information. The cardholder would themselves then be notified that there was a request and would need to consent to the city sharing their information with a relying party. This implicit consent obviously gives more power to the cardholder. They can more easily control their data, and this could be accomplished by having individual online user accounts, for example. When a relying party requests information, a cardholder is pinged with a notification, an email, for example. They enter a PIN to allow access or deny access. This obviously would require a much more robust infrastructure to support, though. Another option is you could have no data capture at all, which is the easiest option perhaps, but it would also preclude any sort of evaluation of the program because usage of the card wouldn't produce any data. So these are sort of the alternative design elements that we were focusing on in this section. And again, not all of them necessary. There are card programs that do not have data capture functions. There are municipal ID programs of all shapes and sizes in this country. But again, those design decisions affect what this program looks like and how to run it, and its cost, ultimately. And so after this particular deliverable, this section of the report was completed, representatives from a range of city departments met to review these design elements and decide which design elements to include of these alternative design elements and which to exclude, at least at the time of launch, right? These programs are adaptable and they can change over time. But we determined that at the time of launch, the program would be available to City of Boston residents, with the ability perhaps to expand to other cities and towns after launch, and that the program would have a back-end system to support user accounts and the sharing of information with relying parties using strong implicit consent of cardholders, but that this functionality wouldn't be active upon launch, and that over time, relying parties, other participants in the program, would create agreements with the city about data sharing. Again, relying parties being community centers, museums, cultural institutions. There's a whole host of, even local businesses, there's a whole host of relying parties that could be participants in the program. So those were the decisions that were made as a result of that part of the study. And the next deliverable and the next section of the report, which you can now read, are the technical security and privacy standards, which is a section that provides a description of essentially the enabling technologies, including digital platforms and programs for administration that are really necessary to run a program, a municipal ID program that includes the design options that we highlighted in the program design section. I am not an IT expert, and so I'm not going to go into great detail about what the enabling technologies are, but the report itself does include a detailed description of what, at a very basic level, you would need in terms of infrastructure to support a program like this. And that section of the report could actually be used in the future as the template or the point of departure for an RFP for a particular technology, or an RFQ for a team of consultants to build the infrastructure for a program. So the next and perhaps the most important deliverable, and the one that I'm going to go into a little bit more in depth, is the implementation plan, which provides detailed steps and outlines a process for the program's operation, and kind of sets a stage for successful implementation. Again, it sets a stage for implementation of a program that looks in that's designed in a particular way. Obviously, that design could be subject to change, but this implementation plan really gives a guide to implementing this particular municipal ID program. So it includes an overview of the program's operational structure vis-a-vis the City of Boston, a preliminary budget for the first 5 years after implementation, and it expands on the baseline design elements and alternative design elements proposed in the program design section. And I just want to review two very important elements of that section because they are elements that I think every counselor who offered some opening remarks touched on. The first is the eligibility criteria for the program. And the second is the way that we propose to store cardholder data. So the first, it's a core component of this plan for implementation, was determining the appropriate eligibility criteria for the program. The program, again, needs to provide adequate access to communities most in need, but without jeopardizing the security of the program as a whole or making it susceptible to fraud. So this really boils down to what documentation or credentials you require an applicant to present during the application process to obtain a card. And it's a very delicate balance because the more documentation or the more exclusive documentation that you require to obtain the card, the harder it is to obtain. But at the same time, the more confident you can be in the assertion of validity of each individual card. And so this is what we would call a level of assurance. Which again is determined by the rigor of the application process. The higher the barrier to entry, which would in this case translate into more exclusive documentation, the more secure the assertion of each identity is, but at the same time, the higher the threshold, the more burdensome the application process becomes, somewhat ironically, mostly for populations that already experience barriers to obtaining formal documentation, which is one of the problems this card sets out to solve. So one method of lowering that threshold to access is to create a point calculus, whereby applicants can actually accrue points using various forms of documentation towards a total score that makes them eligible for the card. This is actually how the application process for municipal IDs in many other cities functions. The ID NYC, for example, has a very elaborate set of documentation that an individual can present to acquire a card. Different documents have a different point value, and if you accrue enough points, you become eligible for the program. Obviously, something which is a very, very strong assertion of identity and residency, something like a driver's license, is ranked very highly. But you could also, the list includes, and our list also includes things like passports, or even a letter from a shelter if you're a person experiencing homelessness, as a way of accruing those points. So it's a way of maintaining the security of the program, but expanding access to the program at the same time. So documents, for those of you who are unfamiliar, really fall into two categories for the purposes of obtaining really any form of identification, and those are proofs of residency and proofs of identity. And so the report that we've provided you includes our proposed list of documents that prove identity and residency that we would accept, each with its own unique point value, which again, an applicant could accrue towards a total score that would make them eligible for a card, and this is really reflective of what we would call like a mid-level of assurance. Not as difficult as it would be to obtain a driver's license, certainly, but auditable in a sense, right? One of the things that we have to think very carefully about is a program like this. There needs to be the ability for the city to verify the validity of a card, which requires some barrier to entry, some eligibility criteria, and what I'm about to talk about, what I'll speak about in a second, a way of storing the data so that the application process can be audited in some way. So the implementation plan proposes several design solutions for minimizing the vulnerability of cardholder data, and we do propose to retain cardholder data. But we propose that the city only store minimal data on each cardholder, which would include the on-card information, so that's all the information that appears on a card, the physical card, as well as the type of documentation that's used to apply for the card. There are other cities, New York, for example, who retain scanned copies of the documents that applicants use to obtain the card. So if you, for example, applied with your passport, the ID NYC program will, or a program officer will scan that passport, and your file, your cardholder data will include that scanned copy of the passport, which we consider to be high risk. And I don't think that I think that other cities would probably agree. But it's very robust. It's very easy to go back and check to make sure if there were concerns about fraud or the validity of cards, to go and verify that yes, indeed, the person the identity that this card asserts is the identity of the person who applied. We also propose to retain the photo, which again is part of the on-card information, and the signature that the applicant provides during the application process. So that's one solution to data capture, which we feel creates a program that balances the safety and security of cardholders and their data with the ability of the city to maintain a program that is not vulnerable to fraud, or exceedingly vulnerable to fraud. The second proposal is to contract with a third-party vendor to manage the cardholder data, because we feel from the assessment, the implicit assessment of this feasibility study, that there are organizations and firms that are better equipped to run an IDMS, an integrated database management system, than the city is. And so these were really the two core data retention, data capture proposals that this feasibility study contains. And the final element of the feasibility study is an evaluation plan. It provides a strategy for conducting evaluations of the program, including recurring and benchmark evaluations, both qualitative and quantitative, so that 1, 2, 3, all the way to 5 years out, we have a method for assessing the health of the program, both in terms of its financial viability as well as how well it's serving residents and what residents think about it. So taken together, what we're calling the Municipal ID feasibility study is really a detailed guide to implementing a municipal ID in Boston. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it could serve as the template for an RFP or an RFQ to procure a technology or a consulting team to build the infrastructure for the program and actually house the data, house cardholder data. And finally, just to give everyone a sense of the timeline of this study, again, the study began in the kind of early spring, early summer of 2017. The feasibility study itself was completed in late May of this year, but the project took longer than expected, and even after the feasibility study was complete, required a great deal of work with the consultants because, as many of you are aware, HHS went through a substantial change in leadership at the end of 2017. And so we've been working since the completion of the feasibility study with the triage group to ensure that what was provided in the report meets the executive needs and expectations of the new leadership of HHS, again, because we went through that change. We are still working through the implications of the report for implementation, and we are especially sensitive to the ongoing struggle currently because of the climate surrounding immigration in this country. This summer especially has been, we've seen a lot of the theoretical threats that we were all worried about, certainly in early 2017. We've seen many of them become realities now. And again, this has really serious implications for implementing a municipal ID program in Boston and elsewhere. The council, I believe, Intergovernmental Relations has provided the council members with a copy of the report, and it will become public shortly. Again, we are working with Chief Martinez to ensure that this report, despite its being initiated under different leadership, reflects the needs and expectations and values of this current HHS leadership team. So that's not so much brief, but an overview of the feasibility study. And I'm happy to answer any questions that any councilors have about that. And if I'm unable to answer questions, I'm happy to follow up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lima, for your thorough presentation. It's greatly appreciated. For the record, we are also joined by City Council President Andrea Campbell, and we're also joined by City Councilor Michael Flaherty. Councilor Campbell, would you like to give an opening statement? Okay. I'd also like to make read two letters into the record. This one is from City Councilor Ayanna Pressley. Dear Mr. Chairman, I regret that due to my previously scheduled new member of Congress orientation in Washington, D.C., I will not be able to attend today's Committee on City Neighborhood Services, Veteran and Military Affairs hearing regarding implementation of a one-card municipal identification program in the City of Boston. I would like to thank the Chair for hosting this hearing and the author of this order for elevating this critical conversation. I was proud to chair a hearing on this matter in October of 2016, and as I stated then, this idea is an example of municipal governments being responsive to the diversity of experience in the City of Boston. Every Bostonian, regardless of immigrant status, contributes to their community and deserves to feel safe in their communities, and lack of formal ID should not be a barrier for anyone. I hope this will be another step towards strengthening the bond between government and the community. I look forward to reviewing the recording, and we'll have staff present. Thank you, Ayanna Pressley, Boston City Council. I'd also like to read another letter from City Councilor Kim Janey. Dear Mr. Chair, I regret that I am unable to attend today's hearing of the Committee on City, Neighborhood Services, and Veteran and Military Affairs regarding the implementation of a one-card municipal identification program in the City of Boston. Creating a municipal ID program that is open to all residents regardless of immigration status, homeless status, or gender identity will allow more residents to have a valid identification card. It also has the potential to make it easier for residents to access city services. I look forward to learning more about this promising program. My staff will be present, and I will review the recording of this hearing. Please read this letter into the record. Sincerely, Kim Janey, Boston City Council. At this time, we will take questions. Again, thank you, Mr. Lima, for your presentation. I have one, maybe two questions, I guess. If this card is integrated, how can we impose safeguards to ensure personal information is not being shared across networks? And can you describe the process for addressing public safety and banking institution? How can we ensure the ID is accessible while avoiding abuse?
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. So to answer your first question, those design elements that I mentioned in kind of the penultimate section of my presentation, which have to do with what information is stored and where it's stored, are really the essential components to building a secure program. Again, what's potentially there's a risk associated with the amount of data that you would store on a potential cardholder, and different cities choose to do that differently. We felt that the amount of information that's retained from the application process creates a program that's more secure, because that information is not valuable in the hands of someone who might wish harm on a cardholder. I'm not a legal expert, so I can't speak to the risk of stored data, whether it's held by the city or by a third-party vendor. I can't speak to the risk of its being obtained by a federal agency, for example. But I can say that in the feasibility study and in thinking about how to design this program, one of the things we were considering is what is the information that we're retaining, and what's the how can we design that retention so that that information is not high risk. And I believe your second question had to do with banking institutions, and the answer there is really, if a program were to be launched, and of course these agreements could be created before launch, but the city would work with financial institutions, whether that's, I don't think currently there are municipal ID programs in this country that work with national financial institutions, but certainly state and local, regional financial institutions. It would require the city coming to an agreement with each individual financial institution, which would essentially comprise the financial institution agreeing to accept that card, the municipal ID card, for some purpose, perhaps to open a bank account. But again, it would require the financial institution feeling that the card itself was secure enough, that the assertion of identity of each card was valid, based on the financial institution's review of the city's issuance policies, the review of the safety and security protocols that the city has in place. And so it would really be about the agreement between each financial institution and the city itself. And again, that's true of all relying parties. And you know, if a BCYF community center or a museum, those relying parties would enter into agreement with the city with a full understanding of how the program works, of the security of the program, and essentially a relying party becomes a relying party when they accept that the assertion of the identity associated with every card is strong, based on their assessment of the city's policies and security safeguards.
Thank you, sir. And at this time, I'd like to ask Councilor Wu if she has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, really helpful. And I was trying to kind of furiously follow along as you were saying this. Also, just for the record, I know you said it's going to be public shortly, but I already tweeted it as soon as we got it, so it's out there. People are able to read. This reads to me as you said, as a direct roadmap for possibly the most comprehensive, most inclusive, most secure program that any city would have across the country, right? I think this is an excellent study that seems to have considered all the major pieces of both how to make it have wide appeal so that this would not just end up being a list of undocumented residents that the president might be eager to get his hands on, but that it would actually be the first card that someone who lives in Boston would show when they're trying to get a drink or enter a building. I've heard from friends in other cities who have this that it ends up becoming a form of civic pride, that you have your Boston or your NYC ID card, and that's the one that you show when you need to make a purchase or verify something. So it is about having that broad cultural appeal and streamlining access and all the different cards. It looks, so at the end, when you get to the implementation plan, accounting for the costs of having an outside vendor manage data security, of having staff to launch the program at a wide enough scale, it looks like it's essentially a $1.5 million to $1.7 million per year investment for 5 years to get it launched.
Yeah.
And then about that much to keep it going, $1.5 million annually.
Right, and again, this is a program that has particular design elements, right?
Yep.
There are you could scale back or scale up certain components of it. You could create more enrollment centers or fewer enrollment centers. There's a fair amount of adaptability and flexibility in terms of the content and the structure of the program, but that was sort of a preliminary budget based on incorporating those essential design elements that we talked about at the beginning, but also some of those optional design alternatives, and then of course the diverse infrastructure that's required to support a program. That includes technology as well as personnel and the administration of the program, the governance body within the city that would be tasked with administering the program. So again, it's preliminary and flexible, but yeah, we attempted to provide a projected budget for the first 5 years after implementation.
So basically, if the city of Boston wanted to launch this at $8 million over the next 5 years, this would be a program that you feel that the office feels is secure enough and hits every other metric of what the residents would want to see.
Yes, to a point. I mean, what residents want may evolve, and so
Yeah.
there's the desire and what's valuable to residents is emergent. It also depends again on what on residents' risk assessment, and we did the demand analysis in 2017, and if we were to do it again, and perhaps we would find different results now, given the fact that just this summer. We currently have the Department of Homeland Security attempting to change the rules of public charge, which is, again, one of those sort of theoretical threats to immigrant communities becoming a very, very stark reality. And so what's valuable to residents and what is a risk for residents is subject to change. And so what we've done is really provide what we think is the ideal program with the ability to build it out, to incorporate other valuable elements down the road, but at a moment in time.
Great. And I thought it was really interesting, this table on page 13 about the percentage of residents who are likely to use the card, that every demographic surveyed was more likely than not to use the card, except for those who don't have a Charlie card and those who are ages 55 to 64. But the seniors 65 and over are once again more likely to use it than not. But across every other demographic of age, of ethnicity, of education level, those who work in Boston, and interestingly, those who were born in the United States, 56% likely to use a municipal ID card, and those who are not born in the United States, so either immigrant residents or kind of first, second, or I suppose for maybe first generation, almost 73%, even more likely to use the card, perhaps reflecting some of the gaps and barriers to formal ID. So, I mean, it seems to me at this point it's a policy question about does the city want to do this and what, and again, where does this fall in the list of priorities of how to be most effective supporting the communities that would be affected or supported by this program. And I feel very comfortable and I'm grateful to the administration for having done the work to this point to say, okay, now we have the plan, we have the cost figures, it's just about where it falls in the city's resources, both from a staffing perspective, and funding of whether we want to, go hit the go button and move forward. Thank you for your presentation.
Welcome.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. At this time, Councilor Zakin, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. I think I certainly agree with Councilor Wu's comments about it seems like this is now just a yes or no decision for the city of Boston. But I do have a couple questions. I think I heard you mention that there were 300,000 potential users of the card in the city of Boston. Is that?
Yeah, so that's a more liberal estimate.
Yeah.
Again, the more conservative estimate is about 32% of Boston residents would not just apply for a card, but apply and use a card.
And is that taking into account, I mean, is that saying as like the discount card or as your library card or as a primary ID? I mean, did it get into that?
So in the demand analysis, respondents to the survey were presented with essentially what a municipal ID could be. That's a really great question because what we didn't do in the demand analysis was just present sort of like your standard ID card as the product. Yeah. We presented a municipal ID card which could potentially include this list of benefits. Access to museums and cultural institutions, a potential integration with the Charlie card, and actually one interesting thing about the survey that we ran is that used a very interesting methodology whereby survey respondents could actually submit their own ideas about valuable functions for the card, and that idea that they submitted would actually be presented to downstream survey respondents as one of the many features of the card that could potentially be incorporated, and then they would be asked to rank which ones they felt were most important or most valuable. Right. And so again, the interest that we are trying to sort of quantify in the demand analysis is really interest in a card with many or all of these very valuable or the most valuable elements to residents included. So I don't think what we're asserting is not that any municipal ID card that the city of Boston were to issue would garner 32% adoption rate. Rather, a municipal ID with certain important benefits attached to it would garner that support.
And what about using it as an ID? I know Councilor Wu mentioned people going to get a drink or at a bank. I mean, what are the rules? I mean, clearly it's a government issued ID, but and I'm not even want to get into the real ID issues about getting on a plane because I know that's not feasible
right.
For this. But I mean, if you're going to a bar or a marijuana dispensary or any of these places, would this, or even a bank or check cash, I mean, would these places accept this? The other cities, what sort of happened?
So municipal ID cards across the country cannot be used to, for example, buy alcohol or tobacco, to get on a plane, for example. There are limitations that all cities, my understanding is that all cities place on these cards, and primarily because they're safety concerns, but also because the purpose of these cards is really to increase access to local services and opportunities. And so, and that access is always mediated by an agreement with the entity that is supplying that benefit. And so, for an individual to use their card in a given location requires that business, organization, agency have an agreement with the city. And so, what the card can or can't be used for is really governed by those agreements. If a card in another city, for example, if someone at a liquor store, for example, were to accept the card, that would be a violation of their own regulations, because municipal IDs in the enabling legislation and policies that govern these programs set forth limitations on what it can be used for. And so, again, that's really has to do more with policy.
So ID is a bit of a misnomer then?
Well, for example, if a relying party, someone in agreement with the city to accept the card were the Boston Police Department, then a municipal ID could be used and serve as a form of identification when, for example, if there's been a break-in at your home and you call the police, one of the first things that an officer who shows up to your home will ask you is for a form of identification. And so if the Boston Police Department and the City of Boston were to come to an agreement about the security of the card and that Boston police officers would accept the card, again, conditional on that agreement, then municipal ID could serve as an ID that an individual could present to a police officer in the event that they were reporting a crime or in some other situation.
Okay.
So it does have ID. It does have ID functions.
But I guess, I mean, and I appreciate and I think it's great that we have, you know, a Charlie card on there, a library, I mean, all the things that make it more appealing to folks who have other options for ID. But, you know, to address some of the real concerns we're talking about, whether it's an undocumented population, homeless population, folks, you know, who for whatever reason, you know, aren't able to get a state-issued or a federal-issued ID, I mean, that does seem to be one of the central things we want to tackle here. And is that, and then I'll stop because I know there are other questions, but is that a policy decision the city has to make, or is that a state law mandate? I mean, do we have the flexibility on that moving forward?
So it's partially a policy decision, and that has to do with what the city feels comfortable, how the city feels comfortable with residents using this card. It also has to do with the strength of our partnerships. There is and this is actually part of the report. There's a phase of implementation, which is almost pre-implementation, which has to do with gathering potential agencies and relying parties that could accept the card to build a robust network of card consumers, essentially, because that's how you really open access for vulnerable residents to these essential services, which again have been the sort of focal point of municipal ID cards since their inception. But at the same time, it creates an array of benefits so that residents who already have driver's licenses, for example, would be interested in getting a card. Which helps you avoid what we're calling this kind of scarlet letter effect.
No, I agree, and I think that's a great idea, and I certainly, I think, would be happy to see this in the form you propose, but I would also urge you and the administration, perhaps the Corporation Council, to look and see what is possible beyond that, because I think while it's great for civic pride, for, you know, people having some form of ID for certain purposes, I think the big issue here is making sure these populations that don't have the ability for whatever reason to get a state ID or a federal ID who are living here in the city of Boston, we need to do, I think, the most we can, consistent with the law, consistent with our own security needs, to do that. So again, I don't know offhand what's permissible. I don't see that the city of Boston you know, would have any liability if someone used this to purchase alcohol or to purchase something else. So I would like to explore that, somewhat expansive. And I'll leave it there because I do have another engagement, but I want to thank you for your work on this. Thank the sponsor and the chair for holding this hearing. I think it's important to see progress and significant progress on this. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Jump in to add a little answer to Councilor Zagum's last question. When we had first launched or first started discussing this in 2015 into 16, it was also contemplated that there would need to be a complementary municipal ID ordinance that would specify the scope of which agencies to loop in and the sort of maximum that the city could push it through municipal law too. So I think that would very much be part of it.
And other municipalities, New York, for example, have city ordinances that are kind of basically the enabling legislation for these programs, which include those, you know, those security policies where the card can be used, so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Zakhem. At this time, I'd like to ask City Council President Andrea Campbell if she has any questions.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn, and thank you to Councilor Wu, the sponsor on this, and thank you for this robust presentation. Look forward to reviewing the report. I'm just curious, was there a reason we were holding up releasing it publicly?
Well, again, so because of the change in leadership in HHS, the scope of the report, its content, the contract itself was initiated with the consulting team that we were working with in 2017. And so we wanted to make sure that the contents of the report reflected Chief Marty Martinez's, you know, expectations of it. And we've been working to tweak elements of the report and include, in some cases, include supplemental material that Chief Martinez felt was necessary. And it took a process of kind of complete review. It took you know, Chief Martinez met with the consulting firm that had been running this process, and who had been working on the report. And so it was really just about making sure that there was an expectations alignment given that shift in leadership.
Excuse me, absolutely very helpful. Obviously, we'll review this in more detail. I think it's great. I agree with what's already been said by Councilor Wu and Councilor Zakhem. This seems to obviously go broader than I originally thought it could, so that's, I think, really fantastic. I'm sort of here to express continued support for this idea. I think it's a great one. And at this point, it does seem like it's on the administration to just say yes or no with respect to, whether or not we're going to do this and to what scale. So be curious to hear at some point what the administration's thoughts are with respect to that, where the mayor is on this, and how we sort of get this, the ball rolling on this. So thank you.
Thank you, Council President. At this time, Councilor Flaherty, do you have any questions?
Welcome to Andre. Is this your first official
I think this is the first time I've testified at a city council hearing,
Well,
yes.
welcome to the City Council chamber, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of you from this point on. Question you had referenced in your testimony, you talked about the survey that, particularly around sort of the most valuable functions, or at least people responded to the survey. Did you get any feedback in terms of the, I guess, the least desirable functions, or what folks did not want to see it used for?
Yeah, interestingly enough, the card serving as a library card didn't garner as much interest amongst survey respondents as we thought it would. That is a function of the card that is, I think, pretty common amongst municipal ID programs, or at the very least, it's presented as a potential benefit very often. And so we went in expecting that an embedded library card number, for example, would be very valuable to survey respondents. But really the far and away the most valuable function for residents seemed to be integrated Charlie card use, right, transportation. And a close second was really discounts and increased access to cultural institutions, small businesses. I mean, it's really, and again, it's referred to municipal IDs are often referred to as kind of a tool for access. And that seemed to be really what the benefits, the values that respondents seem to really respond to. That's where they seem to focus.
Gotcha. Anything around like sort of the election department, elections?
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head, but I can certainly check the survey results and
Yeah, just curious to see in terms of whether it's either reducing or eliminating potential for fraud, or some instances if you're in a line and someone has a change of address, and you literally will have like they'll be flipping through books and pages, and then and just to be someone that comes in that just wants to kind of come in quickly, vote, and get back to work or to pick up their kids, and by having this identification that clearly states some of that information, or they can the election department has access to it. And again, we want to be sensitive to the fact that if you're a not non-citizen, you don't have the ability to vote, and or if you were even accused of voting, that potentially impacts your ability to secure residency. So I want to be sensitive to that, but I know that from a perspective of just trying to help move the lines, particularly that last election, the lines are so long, and you might have someone from the same precinct in the same neighborhood, but they've just literally moved around the corner. That was very time-consuming for folks, and then that created backup and longer lines, and we want to try to make things easier and more efficient for folks to be able to cast their vote. So I just didn't know whether or not anybody on the survey had responded to, because that would be a great way to be able to have that ID that immediately signals that you're actually living at that address and you can actually vote and get on your way and move these lines.
I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I can't remember if kind of a ID for voting came up as a benefit for survey respondents, and again, it could have been it could have been submitted by survey respondents as something that they felt was valuable, and then again, the survey methodology itself would then incorporate that value and present it to downstream survey respondents, and have them rank it along with the ones that we presented them initially. I can't off the top of my head remember, but I believe Intergovernmental Relations has provided the council with copies of the report. That content should be in there. And I think, to my knowledge, municipal IDs in other cities are not accepted as voter IDs. I can check on that for you and get back to you.
And that was, my follow-up question was if you've probably taken a look at what some other major cities have done, and so what they're using their card for, what they're not using their card
Right.
for, and based on that survey, is it sort of dovetail with what sort of New York and San Francisco are doing with their municipal IDs?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say that the real driver of these cards seems to be the sort of cultural benefits that they accrue. So, those sorts of discounts and access. There's actually, the ID NYC did an evaluation of their program, and they did focus groups, and they ran a citywide survey as well, trying to understand, for folks who did apply for and are using the card, why are they doing it? Interestingly enough, one of the big drivers of adoption was simply residents wanting to show their support for a city program. But again, the real meat of what was driving adoption had a lot to do with, to a certain extent, people understanding that applying for and using the card would support vulnerable communities that don't traditionally have very good access to government-issued forms of identification, but also because it provided this list of benefits. I mean, I can't remember exactly what they were, but I believe the ID NYC launched with cardholders having access to reduced price memberships to the, to museums, to the MoMA. I mean, it was a really robust, like a network of benefits that were attached to it, and my understanding was it was really the cultural benefits that were driving interest.
That's great. And I appreciate your time and attention to that and the research. And then throughout your surveys, if there's any follow-up surveys, if you could sort of dial in around what people's thoughts are in terms of elections, and particularly as it pertains to change of address or change of party affiliation. And that seems to cause a little bit of a conundrum as you're approaching the ballot box, and it just causes, and then it's step aside, and then it has to call down to the election department, and they have to confirm your address. And if everything was on that card, and the warden at the precinct would be able to just swipe it and confirm that, yes, Ed Flynn lives, down on Gold Street, or like Florida lives on Columbia Road, and then yep, here's your ballot, you can vote and get in and out of there. I know that that happened, it happens when there's long lines at the elections, and I know in the last couple of elections that's been an issue that's been brought to my attention, that you have, particularly like lifelong residents that have lived in the neighborhood, but they've literally moved across the street or around the corner, or they've changed party affiliation, and that's caused a little bit of backup at that location. But having this card that can be swiped, if you will, it can confirm that their party affiliation and/or their address, I think would help alleviate some of those issues not only at the polling location, but also back here at the election department when they're fielding lots of calls for maybe a machine broke or something like that. So again, just trying to make it more readily accessible and easy and more efficient for folks to come out and participate. So I appreciate your time and attention to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Council Flaherty. At this time, I'd like to ask if anyone in the audience plans to testify or offer comments. Okay. So look, I don't think we need to do another round of questioning. Although I just want to make one point or question. Prior to this job, I worked as a probation officer for 10 years at Suffolk Superior Court. In a lot of my probation, and I supervised the homeless community. And a lot of the homeless community that would come to the courthouse to check in for probation didn't have any ID at all. Although when they did go to the homeless shelter, the homeless shelter usually provided an ID to that person, but having some type of identification was helpful, and that would give that person the opportunity to almost get back on their feet and get involved in different services and programs, but they did need an ID, and a lot of the homeless shelters provided that, which I think was very helpful. And I know in your comments you highlighted the homeless community. What are some of the feedback that you received from the various homeless shelters in Boston on this program?
To be honest, I would have to return to some of the notes from our original stakeholder meetings to speak really accurately about specifically the response from providers shelter providers, for example. But I think, for the most part, and this is not just true of people experiencing homelessness, the problem of lacking formal identification is a problem that has existed for a really, really long time. And there have been for different communities, there have been attempts to try and solve it for young people, for example, and potentially for people experiencing homelessness. But if I'm remembering correctly from those initial meetings with stakeholders, the support for a municipal ID program, again, assuming that program is safe and secure and doesn't serve to further stigmatize populations that are already marginalized, that there is interest among those providers in providing a form of identification for people, such as people experiencing homelessness, who otherwise who don't have the opportunity to acquire that form of identification and are as a result, unfortunately, excluded from a lot of city services, from accessing a lot of opportunities that in many cases would be very beneficial to their health and well-being.
Thank you. That's all I have. Any final comments from Council Wu or Council Flaherty?
Well, I just wanted to, our policy director or research director from the council offered some suggestions as well that we should enter into the record about whether a municipal ID card could also be used to establish partnerships with merchants or businesses in the city. Juan has suggested the movie theater, CVS, Dunkin' Donuts, Stop and Shop, or other businesses. And if there was some program to offer coupons or discounts, that would also help not only with the rollout and interest in the program, but also making sure that there's a wide enough uptake of it. So just another thought to add to the many great things that have been discussed today.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for being here with us, testifying, providing great input, and we appreciate your hard work on this issue. I want to thank Councilor Wu for her leadership, the Mayor's Office for their leadership, and I also want to say thank you to the City Council executive staff for helping us with this hearing. This meeting is now adjourned.